Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Latika Burke. Well, the battle for Western Sydney has begun, with the Prime Minister and Opposition Leader and a sizable media contingent descending on Rooty Hill. Julia Gillard's promising to make a funding offer for two major motorways, but strict terms and conditions apply.
So my offer to Premier O'Farrell is the day that he produces for us a plan that meets those three conditions: people to the city, freight to the port, no tolls on current roads. We will make a funding offer.
The New South Wales Premier, Barry O'Farrell, says he's had a better offer from Tony Abbott.
It's some 6 months since the coalition said that we'd put $1.5 billion towards the WestConnex project, and the way the Prime Minister framed her announcement this morning, it seems that she's setting up a new argument with the state government rather than actually committing to getting this thing built.
And Tony Abbott there. OK, well, joining me to discuss the day in politics, Labor's Nick Champion and the Liberal MP Scott Buchholz. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Nick, now does the Prime Minister have any chance of getting this funding offer agreed to before the September poll?
Well, look, one would hope so. One would hope that the state government of New South Wales would work for the people of Western Sydney rather than against them. It seems to me to be a pretty straightforward, fair offer of working together to deliver a road that is very important for Western Sydney, a road that goes all the way to the city, a road that has freight connection, which is important for Sydney's overall economic growth, and a road without tolls on it. I wouldn't have thought it was that hard for the New South Wales government to work within those parameters, and it hardly seems to me like the Prime Minister's picking a fight. It just seems to me like the Prime Minister's trying to lend a hand.
Well, Scott Buchholz, what's wrong with Julia Gillard's offer?
Well, it's one of those ones that keeps on changing on a daily basis. We remember the offer also that was in New South Wales on that northern highway, where the federal government under Gillard was prepared to fund 80% of it, and then when Labor lost office, that offer then was reduced back to 50%. We've committed that we'll fund that 80% as well. So I think the fundamental problem that this government under Julia Gillard is going to have with the states will come down to trust. It's whether or not they can trust her and whether or not the people of Western Sydney can trust this Prime Minister. Nick
Champion, do you think Scott Buchholz raises a valid point there? Do you think the electorate's grown a bit promise-weary? They hear all these promises thrown at them in the lead-up to election day, and 3 years later they think, well, not much has changed?
Well, look, I think the proof is in the pudding. In my own electorate, the state government of South Australia and the federal government worked together to deliver a $560 million Northern Expressway, which is been built, is now got cars travelling on it and trucks travelling on it every day. And we're obviously now working at other bits of road infrastructure to build in South Australia. We've also got the Superway in South Australia being built, being constructed at the moment, which has a large freight sort of component to it. So we've seen roads in my neck of the woods being built with state and federal governments cooperating. I can't see for the life of me why the New South Wales government can't do it, can't cooperate with the Commonwealth to get Commonwealth funds, and bearing in mind that it will cost at least $13 billion to build this road, you would think that the New South Wales government would be doing everything it could to ensure that it got federal help to build a very important bit of infrastructure for Sydney.
And when we talk infrastructure, Nick Champion, what it actually means is parents sitting in their cars for sometimes hours trying to get to work or do the drop-off. Is this primarily a state Labor problem that Julia Gillard, now as federal Labor leader, has to address and is trying to do so on the eve of the federal election?
Well, look, I think it's probably a function of Sydney's growth, and particularly its growth in places like Western Sydney. One might make some criticisms about what went on in the past and why people didn't plan for this, but I think the more important thing to do is look to the future, look to who's got the more comprehensive plan to provide this infrastructure for Sydney. And I think the Prime Minister's offer is fair and reasonable. and provides a better plan overall because it sees a road going right the way to the city and having freight linkages as well, which is important for economic growth. It strikes me as the New South Wales government is currently proposing sort of a half a road for Sydney that won't do the job for those commuters.
Now, Scott Buchholz, both of you, you and Nick, are not Western Sydney MPs. How is this focus on Rooty Hill in particular, Western Sydney, how does that work in your electorates? Do voters think that they're being left behind, or do they think that for too long Western Sydney has been ignored and it's good that the federal and national attention is on that area?
Yeah, I'd suggest that the people in my electorate and Wright and more widely here in Queensland have made their judgment on the Prime Minister. I mean, you only need to have a look at the recent polling in Western Sydney, and I would suggest that those suburbs, those electorates have also come to their determination on Gillard's performance. And when you go back and have a quick snapshot and in making that assessment on trust and on judgment...
Sorry, Scott, I was asking you about how do you think your electorate feels about the attention being on Western Sydney, not necessarily about Julia Gillard, about this attention on Western Sydney?
And I hope I've given that answer in suggesting that I would say that most Queenslanders, definitely the people of Wright, have made their judgment already with reference to the Prime Minister's performance. Nick made a great point there before that, in order to make your judgment at the next poll, you need to look into the future. But in looking into the future, one of the best ways to judge the future performance is to go back into the past and have a look what this government has said it would do. I was going to mention just quickly about the Prime Minister's captain's pick on Nova Peris, the Prime Minister's single handling of the mining tax, not only the mining tax, the Prime Minister's
all right, Scott, some of those issues have been well canvassed on these airwaves. Nick, one of the comments that the Prime Minister made in her speech last night to the Labor faithful was that she wanted to see Australian workers being put at the front of the queue. Where is this queue? Where does it exist?
Well, look, I think we've seen around the country a number of areas, a number of industries where 457 visas have been used where perhaps they shouldn't have. And I think the meat industry is a classic example of this, of jobs that really weren't skilled, in inverted commas, but the 457 visa was used to bring in labour that could have otherwise been done by Australians and work that had been historically done by Australians. So I think there's been a number of incidences under this Howard government scheme where where it's just been overused a bit, and that's been at the expense of training Australians for jobs or giving Australians the jobs.
The Labor Party...
I think it's perfectly reasonable for the Prime Minister to point this out and to say that we're going to put at the heart of our skilled migration scheme the idea that Australians should come first.
Now, Labor for a long time has railed against that language, back the queue, front of the queue, when it's been used in reference to asylum seekers. Are you comfortable with Labor in government using that type of language in relation to any migration issue?
Well, it doesn't really matter how you dress it up, I guess. It's the sentiment that counts. And I know the sentiments of most of the people in my electorate think that when we've got, unemployment still very high in some suburbs, that we should be doing everything we can to get those people into work and to train those people and to upskill Australians who are currently in work. We should be doing everything on that front before we, import people from overseas to do work in this country just for 1 or 2 years. I mean, most of these 457 visas come for up to, I think, 4 years, and then they go back home. It's not like they're here permanently. And so Australia doesn't benefit from the wages they get. Often they are remitted home, and it doesn't benefit in the long term from the skills that they gain. So I don't think it makes much sense from Australian workers' point of view, but I don't think it actually makes much sense from an Australian economic view, because we don't get the long-term benefit of skills formation in our economy.
Scott Buchholz, if you're elected to government in September, are you happy to see the 457 scheme rorted?
457 visas are a vital part of my electorate and Wright. We produce most of the vegetables for the southeast, for the eastern seaboard of Australia, coming out of the Fastfern and Lockyer valleys. Most of those vegetables, the reality is that they're picked by migrant workers on 457 visas. I suppose it's the debate that I just see that there is a place in our community for those people, because honestly we just don't have the labour here in our parts of the electorate that get that product picked and get it to market. And by the way, I believe that the number of people that we're talking about is less than 0.07% of the Australian work market. So I'd suggest that there's far more important issues to be discussing, rather than a beat up in Western Sydney trying to make the Prime Minister look good under the auspices of jobs. I mean, I think I would suggest that the majority of Australians are seeing through this extended campaign, and as I said earlier, have already made up their decision on which way they're going to cast their vote on September 14th.
Now, I want to ask you both about a report that's emerged this morning, and it's been revealed that the United Nations has voiced its concerns about cuts the Labor government introduced at the start of this year regarding New Start payments. They effectively moved single parents back to New Start and cut their welfare payments. Now, ACOS took this to the UN. Let's have a listen to what Cassandra Goldie had to say about that finding.
We don't have a human rights law in Australia, so we raised our concerns with the United Nations, and we have just been informed that the United Nations did have concerns, and they have written to the federal government back in October, mind you. We've only just found out about this. That's the way they work, and the government still decided to go ahead on 1 January.
Nick Champion, should the government have gone ahead with that cut, knowing what it knew from the UN?
Well, look, I don't think we want the United Nations necessarily dictating domestic policy. I think the government's approach has always been that we prefer people to be in work rather than on government payments. But, you know, we need to have a look at this area of public policy. We need to take into consideration the concerns that ACOS have brought up. I think that
so
would
you
be
like
the
to see those
sensible
cuts
thing to
reversed,
do.
Nick?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, Latika, but I do think we have to be mindful of the effect of these cuts on some individuals. That might not be a reason to totally reverse them, but it might mean an adjustment here and there and some additional assistance getting work. I do think that when you do welfare to work policies, you've got to be mindful of their effects on people, and you've got to constantly be reviewing them to make sure they work.
Scott Buchholz, will the opposition reverse these cuts if in government?
Nick, I think we supported this. Well, we didn't oppose this bill when it hit the House. But one of the stings in the tail with this piece of legislation is that, I think Nick hit it on the head there, is that there needs to be support for these people transitioning into work. And one of the downsides of this piece of legislation that we did support was the abolishment or the taking away of $162 million worth of support for the job network providers, the actual people who helped provide the assistance of getting those people into the workforce. So if we were to have our time over again, it would make sense, if you're going to try and transition people into the workforce, that you give them that level of support rather than take it away.
OK, gentlemen, we have to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for joining us here on Capitol Hill.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you at the same time tomorrow afternoon.
Drum, covering everything from politics.
I think we're all too, cynical to be able to feign surprise at politicians playing politics. It's like sacrilege.
To award show blunders.
Who's Rusty?
Russell Crowe.
Oh my!
To the wide and wacky world of sports.
Once upon a time, being a sports journalist used to be fun. But seriously, tanking, terrorism, match fixing, murder, it sounds like fun.
Join in the conversation on Twitter tonight on ABC News 24.
Tomorrow on ABC News Breakfast, we'll be keeping track of the Prime Minister's charm offensive in Western Sydney. That continues for the rest of the week.
And heart disease has become the biggest killer of Australian women. We'll meet one of the world's leading authorities on the subject to find out why. We hope you can join us.
Reporting from Washington, ABC News, London. New Delhi, reporting from Darwin.
For ABC News 24. Hello, I'm James McHale and thanks for joining me for this national edition of ABC News. Today, the campaign to win back traditional Labor territory. The Prime Minister woos voters in Western Sydney. Fires, floods and cyclones. A new report blames climate change for Australia's summer of extreme weather.
It's like steroids pump up an athlete. This extra heat is pumping up the extreme events.
Thousands of Victorians begin their fight for compensation over the Black Saturday fires. And a bout of gastroenteritis sidelines Queen Elizabeth.
The Queen may be in remarkable health in other respects, but she is 86.
First tonight to federal politics, and commuters in Western Sydney have been the target of today's campaigning. The Prime Minister's offered the New South Wales Premier a funding deal to extend the M4 and M5. For more, our political reporter in Canberra, Latika Burke, joins us now. And Latika, you don't get something for nothing. What are the Prime Minister's terms and conditions on this?
Good afternoon, James. Well, Julia Gillard says she'll make New South Wales a funding offer if the New South Wales Premier tears up his plan for two major motorways in Western Sydney. Now, they are the M5 and the M4, and Julia Gillard would like Barry O'Farrell to adopt her plan instead. Now, that would involve extending the M4 into the CBD and the M5 to reach the crucial Port Botany. Now, the roads would also need to be toll-free and a separate route for freight drawn up.
Premier O'Farrell has put forward a plan. He's calling it West Connects. The problem with Premier O'Farrell's current plan is it doesn't get people to the city, it doesn't get freight to the port, and people are at risk of paying tolls on sections of road they currently use for free.
So, James, those are the PM's conditions. Now, the New South Wales Premier's rejected the Prime Minister's offer as election grandstanding, and he says he favours a $1.5 billion pledge made by the opposition 6 months ago.
Now on to the opposition, Latika. This is an election year in which the party's promising fiscal restraint. Are the Liberals' promises going to add up?
Well, that's the million or perhaps billion-dollar question, because, James, Tony Abbott's made a series of promises and we're not even into the election campaign proper. And some within the Liberals do doubt that Tony Abbott might be able to fund all these, at least not without some very radical cuts to some recurrent spending in the budget. Now, the government's been pursuing Tony Abbott for some time over his plans to repeal the carbon price.